Welcome to another episode of Israel Undiplomatic. I'm Mark Regev, and I'm here with my co-host, Ruthie Blum.
Well, hello, and I'm here with my co-host, Mark Regev. Mark, as somebody pointed out when we entered the studio today, there's nothing to talk about, is there?
Well, there's a lot to talk about, and first and foremost, you traveled from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to do this podcast with me, and this morning there were missiles, and I understand that you were attacked.
I was. Every time I'm out, I get caught in a missile attack. Well, today I was on a train, and there were sirens, and what happened was the conductor said, everybody lie down on the floor below the windows, the level of the windows, and people were confused, and we were lying on the filthy carpet of the train, and just then we were pulling into Ben Gurion Airport.
The station.
And the train station at Ben Gurion Airport. So the conductor said, now everybody get off the train and go to the bomb shelter. So everybody's scurrying out, and we waited for the all clear, and then we had to get back on the train, et cetera. And it turns out that one of the rockets actually hit near Ben Gurion Airport. So most of the projectiles were intercepted, but there was a hit, and I don't know. I hope nobody was hurt. So far, I haven't heard that anybody was. But what's interesting about it, it always brings you back to your reality here. When it happens to, people who live in the North and in the South lived like that for years, and they lived like, certainly the last year, the people in the North who aren't evacuated have been living under this terror daily. But the rest of us, the rest of the country, is brought back to the realization of why we have to win the war. And that brings us to the top news story of the day, naturally, that the entire world is talking about. And that is the re-election, or the election again, of former President Trump. And so, first of all, what are your impressions of that? And what do you think when we were watching the lead up to it?
So obviously, like a lot of Israelis, I was glued to the television. Whoever inhabits the White House has a great influence on U.S.-Israel relations for obvious reasons. And it's important. And I'm not an American citizen. I don't get to vote, but I get to follow it closely. And the Israeli media got to follow it very closely. It was almost, we'll talk about something else that took the attention away from that in a moment, but all the Israelis' networks, they sent their reporters and their anchors. They are all in America there to cover the election. It's a big deal for Israel, who is the American prime minister. Now, I think who's the American president? Sorry, I'm showing my age. What is interesting, I think, is in the polling done in Israel before the election, I think it was two-thirds of Israelis, just over two-thirds of Israelis supported Trump over Harris. And I think there is a perception in this country, rightly or wrongly, that Trump is a stronger friend of Israel. And I think people remember his first term, which included the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. No other president had done it before him. He did it. And then he moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, where it remains. Biden never moved it back. He recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel. He helped orchestrate the Abraham Accords, those peace agreements with the Gulf, with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco in North Africa, and even an agreement that was stillborn with Sudan, but there was still an agreement with Sudan. Unfortunately, the political situation, it just all fell apart. But these peace agreements, he's also remembered for being tough with Iranians, which Israelis like.
He ripped up the Iran deal.
Yeah, he
defunded UNRWA.
Correct, and he took out Soleimani. He took out the head of the Revolutionary Guards. So for all these reasons, I think Israelis who remembered the first term remember him as being a pro-Israel president. And so that's why I think the polling was. It is. I was looking, at some of the red states, where Trump gets 70% of the vote and, the Democrats got 30%. So Israel's like one of them. And it's actually interesting because in 2016, when there was polling between Hillary and Trump, Hillary actually got two-thirds. And Trump wasn't very popular in Israel. I think because of his first term, there was a flip in public feeling in Israel towards Donald Trump.
Well, Israelis got to see his stuff. They saw what he did. And I, among them, I was totally surprised, pleasantly surprised. Well, but here's the thing. it brings us to what happened in America and how the polls got it so wrong, all right? Because you can really call this a landslide. It was a clean sweep. I mean, he took the Electoral College and the popular vote and the Senate and probably the House. So it was, and in the lead up to it, everyone was saying it's neck and neck, neck and neck, neck and neck. Now, you can blame the pollsters or not blame the pollsters. It doesn't really matter. There's something wrong with the model, clearly, et cetera. But I'll tell you what is very relevant here. It's not just that, okay, Israelis, people always ask me, well, what do Israelis think? And I say, it depends which Israelis. Progressive Israelis think like progressive Americans. They have the same the same far left politics. They have the same disdain for patriotism, for America, for Israel. They're similar, okay? Now, which brings us, by the way, to the second huge piece of news in Israel that trumped, so to speak.
Could we stop before we move there? Let's one more about Trump. What is interesting, I think, is that if before I said that like 2/3 of Israelis supported Trump, they couldn't vote, but they supported, according to the polls, that American Jews, who are their cousins, their brothers, their sisters, yes, they're co-religionists, however you want to talk about it, yes. But American Jews were the opposite, where according to exit polls, and the initial will probably get better numbers in the coming days, but some 67% of American Jews supported Harris. And how would you explain that difference between American Jews and Israelis?
Okay, so first of all, the ongoing joke years ago was that if President Obama personally nuked Tel Aviv, that the Jewish vote in America would go down to 75%. Now, you ask me, how's that possible? Well, for some reason, American Jews never vote in their own interest. That's number one. Number two, they seem to care more about abortion and giving transgender rights to underage children and all kinds of issues that you'd say, given what's going on today in the world, given the huge rise in anti-Semitism, given the threat from Iran, given everything, the terrible economy in the United States, given all that, you'd think that someone might, especially Jews don't tend to be the ones, let's say, who most need the abortions, who most need those other issues. First of all, if they tend to be affluent, they can afford on their own dime to do all kinds of things that poor women can't, let's say. But aside from that, you would think that they would care more about anti-Semitism, the rise in anti-Semitism in the world and in America, where it never was before. Not never, but to this extent, never. So, the thing is, I was also asked this by an Israeli newscaster. He said, how do you explain it that Jews in America aren't going to, they don't like Trump or they don't? I say, well, first of all, it's not just Trump, okay? Because I had an American Jewish friend have a conniption fit before Trump was the candidate. And I said, well, and I named other people, other Republicans. And the person went, they're awful too, okay? Jews, I said, they treat the Republican Party the way they treat pork. A lot of them are secular. They don't keep kosher at all, but many just won't eat pork. You say to them, yeah, but you don't keep kosher. Why? No, because pork is going too far. That, I just can't. That's how they feel about the Republican Party. And Trump, of course, because he's so Trump, that gave them even more of an excuse. But don't you think for one second that if it hadn't been Trump, that Trump weren't the candidate, that the Jews would all go vote Republican? Because they wouldn't, and they don't.
It's very interesting because it has not been a quiet period for American Jews since October 7th. You had the horrific massacre and how that was received by parts of the progressive community in America. You've had all the trouble on the campuses where you've seen anti-Semitism raise its ugly head under the cover of anti-Israelism, anti-Zionism, and so forth. And yet, according to the numbers I saw, apparently in 2020, the Democratic ticket of Joe Biden got 69%. And this is, once again, these are only initial numbers now, but it's the lowering of the vote is almost in the margin of error. It's like nothing changes. I know your father wrote a book about this. Why do American Jews...
Why are Jews liberals?
Why are Jews liberals?
And he basically explains it. It's their religion. That's their religion.
We should tell our viewers and listeners who your father was. They might not know.
Well, they could look up Why Are Jews Liberals? Norman Podhoretz. And he was right, and he's still right about that. But I'll tell you something. He also was right about Iran, various things that he wrote about years ago, and he was right about them. But the thing that is extraordinary, I would say, is that Israel and America have so many parallels. Not just the Jewish community in America with the Israeli Jews. There's difference, of course. Partly because, Israelis don't have the luxury that American Jews have. With rockets flying, with wars. I mean, my own son, you know how many times he's been since he was inducted into the army 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. How many times he's had to be in uniform and fight against terrorists and all that. If he had stayed in America, he was born in Israel. He never lived in America. If he had been like his cousins in America, it's a whole different thing. All right. It's a different thing. And you go to the army before you go to college, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that Israel and America have in common, and this is what's good about it actually, is that we are truly liberal societies. Not now, progressive, that's another issue. That's radicalism. We're truly liberal. It's a society that's pluralistic, has all kinds of different people, all kinds of different colors of people, ethnicities of people. It's true, there's a Jewish state, but we've got ethnic backgrounds of all kinds, colors of all kinds. We believe in freedom and freedom of speech and freedom of religion and all of that. So do Americans, right? Across the board. Something got screwed up with the mainstream media and the idea that somehow those aren't liberal values, somehow those are extremist values. Because freedom of speech is not good anymore in America. No, freedom of speech means you might disagree with with the old boys network, which is also ironic considering the degree of feminism and all of that and the Me Too movement. You'd think that they would not be supportive of the old boys network because it's not just a male-female thing. It's an elitist. It's like you belong to our club and we live in our little bubble of academia, media, and the rest of you, we don't have to pay attention to what's actually going on here. And I think what happened with this election in America was, regardless of the polls and regardless of MSNBC and CNN and all that, what you're seeing is that Americans have common sense. They're not that radical. And Israelis, too, the same thing with the current government in Israel. Israelis are not that radical leftist. And when it comes down to it, you get, separate the weeds from all of this. And you say, we have common sense and we know who the good guys and the bad guys are. And we know what healthy patriotism is. And we know all that. And that is what I think this election showed. And what polls in Israel are now showing about the Netanyahu government.
But we'll get to Israel in a second. I want to say one more thing about America.
Okay.
You know that I teach international relations at Reichman University. And I was thinking, what are the foreign relations, how does this affect Israel and the region, this victory by Trump? And so there was something during the Nixon-Kissinger years, which they called the madman theory. And, we have to bomb Hanoi and they have to think we're crazy. We're going to continue bombing them until we get what we need, right? And it's part of the, when you teach international relations and deterrence, madman theory is part of it. Now, because of Trump's legacy from his first term and because of the way he speaks, I think some of Israel's enemies are very worried, especially the Iranians.
Definitely.
And from my point of view, that's a good thing. And if they think he's crazy, let's forget if he's crazy or not, right? I'll leave that to the American voters who've made their decision, right? But that Israel's enemies, especially the mullahs in Tehran, are worried, what could this guy do? That's good, because maybe that'll, if you have all these weapons and no one ever thinks you're going to use them, right? But if people think, this guy, he took out Soleimani, who knows what he's going to do when he's back, yes? Could that be a stabilizing influence in the Middle East? Could that be good? I also want to say that, one of the things that Trump is most proud of is, of course, the Abraham Accords. And is he now going to put his foot on the accelerator and trying to expand the Abraham Accords and Israel-Saudi agreement and so forth? There are some things that you could say could be very positive.
Oh, I think it's all positive. Okay, not could say and not would say, do say. And I'll tell you the most important thing here, whether he's crazy or he's not crazy, etc. And it's not just weapons. He defunds. Iran needs money, and he imposed, maximum sanctions and ripped up the deal, etc. And all those people who accuse him, saying it's the ripping up of the deal that enabled them to proceed with their nuclear program. That is nonsense, total nonsense. But here's what he will do. Now, what we do know about Trump and his supporters is they don't like wars. I mean, they don't like Americans having to go overseas to wars. And you can understand it, especially with all the just awful behavior, what America has done in wars and, absconding, leaving its allies to face death squads by the enemy, etc. However, one thing we can count on is that Trump and his administration will not tie Israel's hands in any of the ways that the Biden administration has been doing. I don't care. People say, oh, look, Biden is the best friend to Israel. He's been tying our hands. He gives us a deadline of the middle of this month, accusing us of starving the Gazans, all kinds of things, and withholding weapons. Now, that is not a friend. Now, what Trump won't do, it's true, Trump won't want to send troops anywhere, but I can tell you one thing. He certainly won't. If we need weapons, bunker busters to bomb Iran, I think he would certainly give them to us. And if we just need to be left alone to get the job done, since we're on the front lines, he'll say, get the job done. That's a huge shift. And that would be good for the whole Middle East and for the peace process and for everybody, including the Palestinians, who at the moment, not a single Palestinian leader deserves any sympathy whatsoever. But in the future, if anybody, again, not because they need a state. No, they don't need a terrorist state in any part of the world, certainly not in Israel or near Israel. So, but that brings us to something else that was really important, and I'll let you talk about that in a second. And that is that while Americans were heading to the ballot boxes, those who had not voted early, a huge story broke out in Israel that trumped the whole thing.
It trumped Trump. It trumped Trump.
And that was that Bibi Netanyahu fired his defense minister, Yoav Galant. And I say, first of all, some people are saying he did it on purpose because America was distracted. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I don't know the workings of his mind. I can tell you one thing. I thought it was long overdue, and I have been writing about this for a long time. I've written 2 main articles about why he needed to be fired, and that one of them was before the war, and the other was more recently, because I've said it on this podcast, the last thing we want when we're in the middle of a war is a defense minister who doesn't want us to win it, who does everything to talk like a diplomat, not the head of the whole military project, and to say things like, well, in negotiations, we have to make painful concessions. Just shut up and let the people whose job it is to say that say it. All you do, you have to cock the weapons. You have to make sure we win. You don't sit around with the chief of staff of the army and say, well, maybe we'll have a ceasefire now. No, maybe we'll have a ceasefire next week. No. Okay, so you go ahead now.
So it actually it was a strange situation yesterday because the major news broadcasts in Israel are at 8 p.m. And all the big Israeli networks, and the small ones too, had sent their big hitters, their correspondents, their anchors to America, and they were all expecting to go on live on how the election was going and to report, even though it was only in the afternoon America time and there was no results yet. But it was a lead up for what was supposed to be wall-to-wall coverage of the U.S. election. And what happened? At 1 minute to 8, it breaks that the prime minister has sacked the defense minister. And then suddenly all these people in America, all these Israeli correspondents had nothing to do because the story here changed and totally focused on internal Israeli politics. Now, I'll give you my opinion and my take on the firing of Galant. I think, as a rule, in the middle of a war, it's not good to fire a defense minister, especially a defense minister with experience and a defense minister who comes from the military and who understands how military works and how you move forces and how you move aircraft and how you move tanks, and someone who in many ways had the credentials to be a very, very good defense minister. And I think it is unfortunate that there was a situation reached where the prime minister felt he had to fire him. Unfortunate, but apparently necessary. And why do I say that? Because you have to have at the top, you have to have a level of confidence, a level of trust between the Prime Minister and his Defence Minister that clearly, unfortunately, wasn't there. Now, I'm very worried sometimes when a group of leaders get into a room and everyone agrees. Is what you call in political science groupthink. That's not good for decision making. You need to hear contrary opinions. You need to have arguments. You need to have vibrant discussions of different policy alternatives. It's not good that everyone thinks the same. But there's a point you pass where you just don't have trust and you don't have confidence, and there's a feeling that something's very wrong here. And I think it's clear that we reached that point. And obviously Netanyahu felt that we'd reached that point. He didn't have confidence or the faith in his defense minister, and he's sacked him and appointed someone else. And we can speak about Yisrael Katz, the incoming defense minister, if we have time. But I want to say on the substance of it, Galant gave a press conference, or not a press conference, he just made a statement later last night. And he talked about his areas of disagreements with the Prime Minister. And he spoke about 3 areas. And in all 3 areas, I think he will have a certain amount of public support, because he said, first of all, he's against any deal with the ultra-Orthodox to prevent them going to the army. And let's be frank, 80% of Israelis believe the ultra-Orthodox should be doing their part too. It's not right that they're not in the army.
I know, but most of them don't really understand what's in the bill on the table. So, you know what?
At the moment, there's no bill.
No,
yeah, but the principle, I'm talking about the principle. I mean, your son has been called back.
No, everyone agrees with the principle. The question is how to get it done. Yeah. Okay. It's the same thing with the hostages. It's the same thing with everything. We all agree on it. We all agree we want peace. We all agree we want hostages. We all agree that more Israeli men and women should serve either in the army or do some kind of national service. There's consensus on that. The question is how you get it done. And I just would like to just make a point about what you said. It's not good to have groupthink. And you're right. And guess where we had the most groupthink over the past year since the October 7th massacre? In the army, the heads of the army, not the soldiers. Okay? The groupthink was the entire defense establishment, which was a very dangerous thing. It's the defense establishment that should have been saying, whoa, we got to change our hard disk here because we were asleep on the job, or it's not that they were asleep on the job. They weren't. They had a fantasy about our security situation that turned out to be wrong, right? Even if you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, because Netanyahu was part of it for years and years. They all sort of had this idea that Hamas was deterred. So forget about that for a minute. But since the massacre, you had the whole, as I said, the good old boys network, these guys, and they've kept out anybody who disagreed with them over the years. They've prevented promotions from people who were not of the right milieu, okay? And it's time we stop that. And there's a theory that very soon our chief of staff of the army is also going to resign. Because, again, he and Galant had this sort of, again, groupthink, which is very bad. But I'll tell you the most dangerous thing was that Galant was a rat-fink going to Washington. He was colluding with Secretary of Defense Austin. He was leaking stuff out of secret meetings. His office, and that is why if you read social media, and you'll see all the old American diplomats are saying, oh, this is terrible. Galant is our best friend in Washington, which exactly shows you why he has to go. What's going on here? He was supporting Biden's. It was as though he was saying to Biden, you got to help me prevent Netanyahu from doing what he wants to do. Now, that is awful. And as I said, he should have been fired a long time ago. And it's not unheard of for in the middle of wars for there to be replacements with generals, et cetera. But also the hypocrisy of the people now saying, notice, by the way, who's mourning this? The far left in Israel. The far left. That's one thing. And the other is that they're hypocrites because they've been saying that Netanyahu should be replaced in the middle of the war. So suddenly you can't replace Galant in the middle of a war. It's sickening already.
Listen, Ruthie, I want to disagree with you. on a number of points. Not on all your points, but on some of the points. You're shocked. You're shocked. There's gambling in this restaurant. What's the famous line from Casablanca?
Right. Yeah,
yes.
exactly.
Look, the Defense Minister of Israel has a good relationship with the head of the Pentagon, with the American Defense Secretary. That's a good thing. That they would speak on the phone regularly, that's a good thing. You want allies talking. Now, it's clear that the Americans liked Galant, and there was not just the Defense Secretary, also the Secretary of State and others would like to talk to Galant.
Very bad sign right there.
All right.
If
so it wasn't more than that.
If Blinken liked him, that's enough for you to know who he was.
He was seen as someone who the Americans could talk to, maybe for, not as challenging for them as Netanyahu. But on the whole, I would say a defense secretary who has a good relationship with the Americans is good from our perspective, a defense minister, I should say, in Israel. It's not a bad thing. And I don't, when the history is written about this period we're going through now, the idea that, that somehow there was some sort of plot between Galant and the Americans, I just, that's a bit, too much conspiracy theory sort of thing for me. It's clear the bottom line was this. The Prime Minister thought that he didn't have the trust or the faith or the confidence in the defense minister, and he thought it was time to bring in someone new. Now, he's brought in someone, Israel Katz, who's the outgoing now foreign minister, who was, I think, a paratrooper. I think he was an officer in the paratroopers, but he wasn't a general or anything. And this raises the question in Israel. Most of our defense ministers have historically been people who were former military people. People who grew up in the military, often former generals sometimes, like Ehud Barak and Yitzhak Rabin, former chiefs of staff, or people like, Ariel Sharon was defense minister, all these people who had illustrious military careers. When they went into politics, they became defense ministers.
They became leftists.
No.
When they went into politics.
That's a whole different story. I won't even go there. But all I'm saying about Israel Katz is that we've had defense ministers who were not from the military. The first and founding defense minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. There was Moshe Aarons, who was twice or three times defense minister for the Likud, who was also, right? And the idea is that you can have a defense minister who's not from the military. Yeah. He has to be smart, has to be strong. But the idea that we have a defense, most of the the current Lloyd Austin is separate, but most of the American secretaries of defense don't come from the military.
And by the way, our illustrious generals who have been defense minister, look what flops they turned out to be. The most recent ones. Okay, I'm not talking about the entire history of the state. It was like, oh, okay, so you have all this experience and you all this and that you have even less of an excuse to be behaving the way you're behaving. And now, Israel Katz may or may not be good at this job. I don't know. What I know is that he will not go against the cabinet. And that's not to say, no disagreements. That is to say that he is on the same page about winning this war, about the goals of the war, about doing everything that needs to be done, and including rescuing the hostages, of course, but not kowtowing and pandering to the rioters in the streets who have taken over the hostage families in a very cynical way. No, he's not one of them. And he doesn't put up with any crap from international bodies that go after us. He's been very firm about that. And in that respect, I'm not that worried.
So I want to ask you a final question. In Galant's statement after being fired, he talked about the hostages. He talked about the importance of getting the ultra-Orthodox into the army. And the final thing he said, where he had a disagreement with the Prime Minister, was on a commission of inquiry to what happened on October 7th, 2023. And I wanted to ask you, what's your position on that? Do you think there should be
an inquiry? Oh, no. But here's the, again. The entire country wants an inquiry into October 7th. The question is, who's conducting it? He wants judges. He wants the Old Boys Network to be conducting it. The other side wants more outside, or, it's hard to explain to people who don't live in Israel the difference between this kind of commission of inquiry and that kind. There we go again. I'm sorry, I don't want anybody who is in a robe on the Supreme Court or anything to do with our Attorney General, or anything anywhere near that inquiry. I got to tell you right now.
So we can agree that in the end there has to be an inquiry.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's clear both the military, the intelligence, and the political level have to answer questions and have to find out how is it that Israel was taken by surprise on October 7th?
No question about it.
How is it that we weren't ready for the attack?
No question.
What all the mistakes that were made, and it's clear that there were multiple mistakes were made. The question is, how do you do a commission of inquiry? In Israel, the tradition is a National Commission of Inquiry is appointed by the President of the Supreme Court. And the trouble with that today is the terrible relationship between the executive and the judiciary that stems to Netanyahu's proposals as of before the war to judicial reform. And I think Netanyahu and a lot of the people around him would have trouble thinking that that sort of inquiry could be objective. But how do you solve that problem? I have a solution.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
The solution is it's clear that the executive branch has to appoint the Commission of Inquiry. And according to the rules, the Chief Justice of Israel gets to appoint the members of the inquiry, right? So maybe there can be a bit of behind the scenes talking to different people, and there will be understandings reached that if we agree to a National Commission of Inquiry, there'll be agreement on who could be respected by both sides to conduct the inquiry. Maybe that's the way out of it.
Maybe. Although, again, it brings us back to the whole issue of judicial reform, because one of the biggest bones of contention that caused these, lunatics to take to the streets with their drums and their blocking of the highway.
Ruthie, look, you don't have to agree with these people, but they're not lunatics. There's some very good people out there protesting who believe the country's in the wrong direction. This is what democracy is about. You can say you disagree with them without calling them lunatics.
Okay, so what's lunacy about their protests is that they said it was the end of democracy. That's lunacy. I'm sorry. There is no end of democracy. And if we had reforms, judicial reforms, it wouldn't be an end of democracy. And Netanyahu is not a dictator.
But here we go back to America. A lot of people, they would say the same thing said about Trump, that it's the end of American democracy.
Of course, and they're wrong. And they're wrong. They're wrong about Netanyahu. Okay, that's lunacy to say that. And that was the theme of those protests. And today now is that Netanyahu is a dictator and he's not going to allow elections. And just like with Trump, there won't be elections anymore. And it's nonsense. Okay, but here's the thing: one of the biggest bones of contention was all we said, those of us in favor of judicial reforms, is you cannot have judges and lawyers appointing the next judges. Again, this whole, the network.
That's a whole separate.
But again, with the Commission of Inquiry, it always boils down to the people who want people on the panels. Now, I don't have an answer to that. I agree with you that we need some kind of consensus on who sits on those things, and I don't have an answer to that. But I got to tell you, I will be really happy if we get to the point where we have won the war and returned the hostages and defeated Hezbollah and erased Hamas from Gaza and done many, many things. And at that point, I'll say, okay, now we can turn our attention to who gets to sit on the Commission of Inquiry. Because honestly, right now, I don't care. And I don't even care who's at fault for October 7th. And none of them. I only care how they've behaved since October 7th. Right now, I care.
And the most important thing is that we win.
Yes.
We have to win.
Unfortunately, there is where the divide is in Israeli society. But guess what? Just as we saw with the U.S. election, it's not that big of a divide. It's a lie that it's a big divide. Most Israelis, the soldiers are patriotic. Most Israelis have a common sense view that we can't leave the enemies in power, not in Lebanon and not in Gaza, and that we have to do something about the Iranian nuclear threat, the Iranian also conventional threat, not just nuclear threat, and that most Israelis are not that radical. They're not. They are, and many people don't know, the minutia of these politics and all that. There is such a thing as good guys and bad guys. And we've started in this Orwellian universe that the progressives are trying to impose on everybody else. It's like everything is topsy-turvy. Well, no. And Israelis are not topsy-turvy about it. And neither are Americans. They're not.
So we will continue this conversation next week because we've reached the end of our time. We will be following very closely how Israel Katz moves into his job as defense minister. And we're watching very closely in Washington who President-elect Trump chooses to be in his foreign policy and national security team, because that has great influence on what happens in the U.S.-Israel relationship. I look forward to speaking to you again next week, Ruthie.
Same here, Mark.